Hello everyone, today I will be participating in someone else's project, which I'm very happy to do so. I'm pretty honored at being asked, so let me tell you a bit about it. A graduate student from the UK, a women's studies student by the name of Rebecca Wells, has approached me and asked if I would take part in a survey of hers on gender relations. It's going to be 3 surveys. Each one has questions that could be considered very controversial. This is going to be survey 1. I'm going to answer these questions to the best of my abilities. I don't promise that I won't make any uhs or ums or anything like that, but I do promise to answer each of these questions to my full abilities, so we'll see how this goes. I've got my laptop right here. She sent me the questions via YouTube, and we'll see where it goes, shall we? Question 1. Now, bear with me, I don't have my glasses at the moment, so I'm going to have to lean really close to see these. Question 1 is, do you think that due to the rise in academic excellence shown by girls, the increase in earning power and varied career choices available to many women, along with an alleged decline in both of these factors for large numbers of males, that we are truly heading towards a future that will be distinctly female? And do you welcome that? Well, first, I don't think that more opportunity for women necessarily equates to less opportunity for men. Yes, there are a great many women graduating college and steamrolling the workplace, and I think that's fantastic. To me, that doesn't necessarily mean that fewer men will have opportunities, as first of all, college, the traditional roles of college education and already established career paths are not necessarily the only ways to make one's name out in the world. It's not. A lot of people also make their own opportunities. A good example of the non-traditional path to making one's name would probably be Bill Gates. He didn't finish college. I think that women doing so well in college and doing so well in the more traditional and already established careers means that the fact that women are equally capable as men can no longer be ignored. That they are equally capable in absolutely everything that they put themselves to. That can no longer be ignored, and I think that has a lot to do with how many women have been determined to go through academics and determined to make a name for themselves in their careers. I don't think this necessarily means that the world will become more female, as the world has always been just as female as it has been male. It's just that the female voice, or women in general, have been suppressed. Their voices have been unheard. But the world has always been just as female as it has been male, as we are one half of the entire species. Whether or not I would welcome a future that was more distinctly female than male, personally, I would welcome a future that had a more balanced perspective. I think it is very possible for that balance to turn on its head in the reverse, to go to the reverse extreme than it has been in our immediate history. In our immediate history, most things have been patriarchal, especially religions, politics, ways of life. Everything has been looked at through patriarchal form. But that hasn't really always been the case, at least according to some historians. According to some historians, including art historian Merlin Stone, who is the author of When God Was a Woman, once upon a time, before Egyptian times, a lot of the religions, instead of having a god or creator, the creator, in a male form, they had the creator in a female form. God was a woman, or depicted as a woman, because of women's connection to and ability to give life, to give birth. The creator was represented as a female. So during those times, women who could be high priestesses were usually the more educated, and everything family-wise was done through matriarchal form. The children took the mother's last name, and males would take their wife's last name in the next family. Everything was, socially, everything was turned on its head from what it is now. I'm assuming that there might have been a little bit of resentment over that, because once God started popping up in the masculine form, once people started finding their power or God's power in the masculine form, then the representation of God in the feminine form, or all representations of the feminine divine, were turned into something evil. I think maybe the way that people of patriarchal religious forms decimated all signs of the matriarchal religious forms, there was probably a lot of resentment there. And after most religions became patriarchal, then the woman, as opposed to being a holy figure that gave life, became a submissive companion to man, and their life-bearing was turned from a wonderful and completely unselfish gift into a punishment by God. Now, so if you're asking me if I think things in sex relations could completely turn on their head, and female could be the more revered, and female could be the more respected, whereas male is the more put down and suppressed, then yes, I think that's very, very possible. I think things like that have happened before. But I don't think it's wise to do so. Personally, I don't like this idea that in order for one side to rise, the other has to fall. I think that's a very foolish way to do things. I think that as a species, if we're constantly arguing over who should have the upper hand, then we're never really going to get anywhere. We're constantly going to be bickering at each other. So, as far as a future more distinctly female, I would welcome a future in which females were actually represented how they are, and were able to completely speak for themselves, and were very much part of the collective consciousness instead of largely ignored. I don't like being ignored. Personally, I don't like the fact that I didn't grow up with many female role models, because even though women have always been completely equal in making history, they have never been equal in being shown and in being remembered. A lot of the amazing women that I should have been looking up to since I was a little girl, I'd never even heard of until a year or so ago. And that's very disappointing to me. But I would welcome a future that is more balanced, in which both men and women have a say, in which both men and women have a voice. The fact is, we are two halves of the same species. We are one and the same. We aren't just female and we aren't just male. We aren't man. We are human. And personally, I would welcome a future in which I didn't have to tell my sons or my daughters that they are somehow worth less than the other. Alright, now we're on to question 2 of survey 1. I apologize again, as I do not have my glasses. I have to get my face right up on the screen. So, question 2. Do you believe that it is actually high time we had more women taking leading roles in politics, business, social policy, etc., and what changes would you expect if this occurs? So, my answer to this is completely yes in every way possible whatsoever. It is more than high time that women are heard equally all throughout the board in every way possible. To not listen to half of the entire species is probably the insanity that has kept us doing the same thing over and 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 over again throughout history. The fact that everyone who could speak up and who could have a voice and obviously has something to say, the fact that they're not being heard in some of the most important decisions made throughout the world is complete insanity. Completely. It is beyond stupid. And I am tired of the world still pandering to it, to this idea that males have to lead in all these different things. Women are just as capable in politics and business and all this stuff. They're equally capable, and the fact that they're not being heard, that they have a distinct perspective because they are forced into certain roles and because they are being squashed and mistreated, and the fact that they're not being heard means that treatment like this will continue for people possibly indefinitely if we don't do something about it now. I love the fact that I am part of the world as it is changing for the better. I do not ever want to see the world go back to squashing half of its population or any of its population. That's enough. We've done that enough. Been there, done that. If we aren't any smarter by now, then maybe it's just time to push the button. Okay? I think this would bring an unbelievable change to the world. I think it will miraculously sweep away a lot of the problems as far as social policy and all that other stuff goes. I don't think it will solve all of our problems because it just doesn't work that way. We as a species are, even if we do start listening to all of us, we are still pretty stupid. We are. I mean, we're getting there, some of us, but we are still pretty stupid. I mean, obviously, having men and women both heard equally isn't going to miraculously change the climate issue or anything like that. We're still going to have things to work through, and I don't think we should let that discourage us from doing it, from allowing women to be heard equally all throughout the board. In fact, there is no allow about it, it's just common sense at this point. We're trying not to be barbarians. I think maybe one of the reasons why women haven't been listened to in all those different ways for a while is because they know better than to war. They would object very heavily to war since they are always the ones completely decimated by it, them and their children, and who receive no benefit from it, so they know better, really. I think that probably has a lot to do with why they're not listened to. 'Cause, guys want to fight. Come on, let's go. No. I'm not saying there wouldn't be any war, but let's get off the subject of war. I don't think that it would miraculously solve all the problems of the world, and I don't think that that pressure should be put on it. I think we should break the barriers. We need to break the barriers. Women need to be in on everything, and men need to learn to accept that we are, again, half of the entire species, and we deserve an equal say in everything. Everything. But once the barriers are actually broken, I would really like to live in a time where when somebody wants to speak up or somebody wants a position or something like that, then no one would have to pay attention to race, sex, any class, any of that ridiculous nonsense that we use to separate ourselves from ourselves. That's my opinion on that. Alright, question 3. We're halfway there. Again, I have to read it from the screen. Do you feel that any shift in society that favors an upcoming generation of women will have mostly resulted from our moving away from traditional, exclusively male-dominated heavy industries the role played by feminist criticism in the media, or a general loss of belief in what may be termed as old-fashioned values? Or is it simply down to women outcompeting men? Well, first, I don't think it specifically has anything to do with moving away from male-dominated industries, as most industries historically have been male-dominated, as women have only really been allowed to be, before the last 200 years, women were only really allowed to be mothers and wives, or nuns, possibly teachers, or nannies. Anything that revolved around children and children's upbringing. So I don't think it has anything to do with moving away from those industries as much as it has to do with people finally having to acknowledge that women are capable of working in the exact same industries. For example, during World War II, when most of the men were away at war, women had to fulfill the positions that men left behind. And this included very heavily male-dominated industries, such as the manufacture of weapons, planes, vehicles, things like that. They performed their jobs very sufficiently. They did very well at them, and even though when the men came back they were forced to return home or lost their jobs, they still proved that they were capable of the exact same things. And that's been the case all throughout history, even though women have not received the same amount of, if any, acknowledgement for their participation in things. They've still always, at some point or another, filled those same roles that men would. For example, women all throughout history have been farmhands. During the Industrial Revolution, poor women would work in the mines just like poor men. Sometimes even children would. And there's always some story, whether it's the Civil War, whether it's wars in China, where women have run off to participate in war, though why they would want to have anything to do with that insanity is beyond me. They still perform the tasks and the roles of a soldier. So I don't think it has anything to do with the world shifting away from male-heavy industries, as we haven't, really. We still rely on some of the same industries, and some of the industries, the newer industries now, are considered male-dominated only because males want to dominate them. But I don't think it has anything to do with shifting away from those as much as it has to do with the fact that we are incapable, at least at this point, because it's recorded so much and in so much detail, we are no longer capable of ignoring the fact that women are capable of performing the same tasks as men and performing in the same industries, because they've proven it again and 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 again. What I think has more to do with it is moving away from so much emphasis of patriarchal religion. By saying that, I don't mean that we're necessarily abandoning patriarchal religions, as we are moving away from the bigotry within them. People, as they become more educated on sacred texts and began reading them for themselves, and as they've become more educated on the world and on each other because of our closer contact and further communication, I think people began to realize that the roles assigned in a lot of patriarchal texts for women as the subordinate, parts in it, for example, parts in the Bible that say that women should not speak up in church, and women should not hold authority over men. I think people began to realize more and more that this had less to do with any actual spiritual advice and more to do with the bigotry of the authors. That this wasn't a higher being communicating with people, telling people that women should be the subordinate. These were the men that influenced the religion, telling women that women should be subordinate and telling men that men should dominate women. I don't know how much feminine criticism necessarily has to do with the way women are perceived today. Certainly the feminist movement does. And I'm sure that the people who are really into the debate have also benefited a lot from feminist criticism. But as far as the way that women are perceived in everyday life, I think women artists and people who express themselves artistically through poetry, fiction, movies, things like that, I think they have a lot more to do with how women are perceived today. Because, instead of having to rely on, because through expression, people really connect a little better with other people, with other human beings, and they see the humanity in that person. Because when they go to see a movie and there's an actual woman expressing what things are like for women, then they're seeing that and connecting with that, as opposed to just seeing women on screen being represented by men how men would like to see women. I think having that more balanced perspective does a lot just for everyday understanding. Maybe more so than the criticism. Although, hey, I appreciate the criticism, but I'm not everybody. As far as whether or not the upcoming generation of women and their higher position goes, whether or not that has to do with women outcompeting men, I'd say that has had to be completely necessary. As far as politics or industry or business, in order for women to be acknowledged in any way whatsoever or to achieve any position, they have had to be the most extraordinary human beings that have ever walked the earth just to achieve any sort of position over in any industry. So yes, they've had to outcompete men at every turn. I almost think that's I'm proud of them and I'm glad that they did, because their achievements have made the world better for me and have made the world better for, if I have children, my daughters. They've made the world better for them. But I think it's a shame that so much emphasis has to be put on competition. I think, honestly, I'd like to get to a point where people can just be and do what they do and do what they love, and they don't have to sweat and bleed and break themselves just to get any sort of small acknowledgement in industries or parts of the world that they better just by doing their life's work. I'd like to think that one day women could be acknowledged equally to their male counterparts and whatever they choose to do, without having to enslave themselves to the ideal of it. But that's just my opinion. That's just what I'd like to see one day. I guess that's my answer to that question. Now here we are at question 4. Do you think we may be in danger of creating a generation of lost boys who will fail in school, who will not move on to get decent jobs, and who will become angry and disaffected? Should we be taking steps to prevent that now? I think that if all of the emphasis in schools are put on girls' accomplishments and girls' achievement, specifically girls' achievement over boys, then yes, anyone in an unequal situation does have the capability of forming resentment, especially kids. I think the same thing was seen back when only boys' achievements, whether in sports or otherwise, were really emphasized in schools. It did create a generation of lost girls who, statistically, mostly just became pregnant or turned to marriage. They didn't see any other point. They didn't see any other opportunities. The point is, to me, in my opinion, that equal opportunity should be made in school programs for both girls and boys. Every program that you have for girls, you should also have for boys, and vice versa. Even if you keep them separated at the time, to make sure that they don't feel as if they have to compete with one another. Take adult programs like the Olympics, for example, right now. We now have every sport available for both men and women. They are both able to compete. They simply do so on different teams so as not to feel the urge to necessarily have to compete with one another or to build any resentments because one side may perform better at some sport or to kick up ego or anything like that. I think the same thing should be offered to boys and girls at school. You offer a wide variety of programs, and you offer some programs, you offer each of the programs for boys and for girls separately, but for those who are even further ahead in the gender socialization scheme of things, you offer programs in which both boys and girls can enter together and work together. In my opinion, I think that's the best thing that you can do to prevent any kind of resentment, to prevent the resentment of more emphasis being put on one sex or the other, because boys and girls can't, choose which one they're born as. So you need to make sure that they can choose everything that they can and want to participate in. Really, I think they should be taught that the only difference between them is their sex organs and their reproductive capabilities. Their reproductive organs and reproductive capabilities, because really, that's the only difference. They're going to grow a little differently, that's it. I think if they're taught that from an early age, then you'll essentially be teaching them respect for each other as they grow older, and you'll also prevent any instances in which one will end up resenting the other, in my opinion. Now on to question number 5. There's been a lot of debate across the media about the idea of the redundant male. Do you think these recent changes in society lend credence to the notion that males are becoming redundant? What are your concerns about that? First, absolutely no, in no way whatsoever do I believe in the redundancy of males, or anyone for that matter. I don't believe anyone is redundant. I think every person has something to offer to the world. But maybe that's just me. Personally, I think this idea of redundancy is ridiculous and has been used against women before. Back in the 1800s, before women were allowed to be anything other than wives and mothers, or nuns, or occasionally maybe nannies and teachers, back when women had no other occupations that they could turn to legitimately, there were a lot of women who were considered redundant women, which, like I said, is a pretty ridiculous idea. The women who were called redundant were the ones who weren't easily married off, the spinsters, or the aunt or sister figures who stayed with a family and never actually started a family of her own. The idea was to start a family and to become a subordinate within that family. But if women weren't as capable of that, either because they were not as attractive, or because they were willful, or because they just didn't want to, then they were considered the redundant woman, and they would live with a family member and do nothing with their lives. Now that we know that women are capable of doing absolutely everything else, including writing, activism, just a host of more and more things, we know that this idea of the redundant woman was really just wasting someone's talents and wasting someone's life. The idea that you can box someone in and call them redundant. I think that if men are moving away from otherwise more male-dominated roles, or the traditional roles are no longer up for grabs, or they just don't want them anymore, then they'll just move on to something else. They'll become writers or teachers or doctors or They can even be stay-at-home parents and caretakers for elderly relations. They can become whatever they want, just like everyone else. What I think is redundant is trying to define people by their sex role or their sex organs. This idea that they have to be defined by their sexual function or by their traditional function. Personally, I think that those sex roles are completely redundant because, for one, our population has gotten so big and our way of living is so unsustainable that we don't even really need to breed as much. We don't. I mean, I would never advocate a lack of choice on whether or not someone breeds. If someone wants to have children, then that's great. If someone wants to just adopt, then that's great. If someone doesn't want any, I'm fine with that too. The fact is we don't specifically need to breed as much anymore. So what is truly redundant, in my opinion, is this idea that people's lives need to be shaped around otherwise breeding functions. I think people are starting to realize that they are not just sex organs. You know, women are not just sex and sex organs. They are people. They are human beings and are capable of everything that other human beings are. Just like men are not just penises. Although I've heard some of them say that they're a penis with two eyes, right? I've heard at least one comedian say exactly that. But you know what? They are people. And they have their enjoyments, and they have their talents and their skills, and they can go off and live them. This idea of redundancy, calling one or the other sex redundant, is just another attempt to put that sex down. Just like women had been put down by it. Put down and put down and put down and put down and told over and over again that they were not capable, so that they would not offer competition to the other sex. That is my opinion. Question 6. Have you ever discussed your opinions with other women, and did they agree with you? Now, unfortunately, because of my work in entertainment-based media and things like that, most of the women that I hang out with are more focused on makeup, clothes, who knows who, hairstyles, things like that. And a lot of them don't really see a problem in gender relations unless it's off in some far-off country. They don't see the big picture of it or don't see it the same way. But usually I can find some middle ground if I just mention things like men and women should be treated in exactly equal forms, or they should speak to each other and express themselves to each other equally and in their entirety, be heard, and that how they like to be treated should be in constant negotiation, with each side being respected for what they want, etc. Usually if I use terms like equality and things like that, and how both men and women should be heard, then I can usually find a common ground. As far as the rest, just like everyone else who uses the internet or social media, I usually tend to gravitate towards people who share similar beliefs or similar interests. So I do have plenty of followers on Facebook or Twitter who have expressed agreement with my opinions. Whether or not people specifically agree, I mean, agreement isn't a necessity for me. I am perfectly capable of holding my own opinions, whether everyone around me agrees or not. And, quite frankly, I like hearing differing opinions, so long as they're expressed to me as respectfully as I attempt to express mine. And you've heard a bit of my opinions now. That's 6 questions. That is the end of Survey 1. Again, I am very happy to be part of this project, and I will be getting Survey 2 out as soon as I am able.